Most businesses do not have a proof strategy. They have proof objects, a testimonial section, a few Google reviews, a client logo, an award badge, a case study nobody's touched in 3 years, maybe a quote from a happy client that says they were great. None of that's bad, but proof is not supposed to sit on a page and make a business look decorated. Proof has a job. It is supposed to answer whatever uncertainty is stopping the buyer from moving forward. That is where a lot of businesses get this wrong. They think proof means praise. Someone said something nice, someone left 5 stars, someone wrote, "Great team, I highly recommend." And praise can help, but praise is usually not enough on its own. Serious buyers are not just asking, do other people like this business? They're asking more specific questions. Can I trust this business with my situation? Do they understand people like me? What happens if I choose them? Will this be handled carefully? Will I regret this later? Those are different questions, so they need different kinds of proof. That's the distinction. Praise makes the business sound good, proof makes the decision feel safer, and for high-trust businesses, that matters. Before I go further, I should clarify the lens I'm looking at this through. Proof can exist in a lot of forms. It can be written, it can be spoken, it can show up in reviews, case studies, referrals, credentials, examples, process pages, sales conversations, client emails, or client stories. So this is not me saying every piece of proof needs to be a video. That'd be ridiculous. I build film systems, so I am naturally looking at this through one specific question. What parts of trust are easier to understand when a buyer can actually see the people, hear the explanation, understand the process, and listen to someone who has already been through it? That's where I see that video can be useful, not because it's magic. Video is just one way to make certain kinds of proof easier to understand before the first conversation, especially in businesses where the buyer isn't just evaluating information, they're evaluating things like judgment, fit, risk, confidence, and whether reaching out feels like the right next step. So the better question isn't, do we have testimonials? The better question is, what does the buyer still need proof of? That is the whole point of this episode. Proof is not one thing. Proof has different jobs. The first job is legitimacy. This is the most basic level. The buyer wants to know, is this a real business? Are they established? Are they credible? Can I take them seriously? This is where credentials, years in the business, awards, affiliations, recognizable clients, rankings, review count, and professional presentation matter. They help the buyer understand that the business isn't random. They create a baseline of credibility. But legitimacy is not the whole decision. A firm can look established and still not feel right. An advisor can have a few awards and still not feel relevant. A law firm can have decades of experience and still leave the buyer unsure about what working with them would actually be like. A builder can have beautiful project photos and still leave the buyer wondering whether the process will be organized or frustrating. Legitimacy gets you considered. It doesn't automatically create confidence. That is where the second job of proof comes in, relevance. The buyer isn't only asking, has this worked before? They're asking, has this worked for someone like me? And that phrase matters, someone like me. A business owner doesn't just want to know that you help people, they want to know that you understand business owners. A family choosing a wealth advisor doesn't just want to know that you manage money, they want to know that you understand the responsibility, the complexity, and the personal weight of their situation. A homeowner choosing a design build firm doesn't just want to know that you've done projects, they want to know that you've handled projects with the same kind of budget and uncertainty and taste and timeline and decision pressure. Generic praise does not answer that. They were great doesn't answer that. A client story can. And when I say client story, I don't mean polished testimonial where someone says the company was wonderful for 30 seconds. I mean a real client explaining what was happening before they reached out, what they were unsure about, what mattered in the decision, what the process was like, and why they were glad they chose that business. That gives the future buyer something more useful than praise. It gives them a mirror. They can hear someone describe a situation that may resemble their own. They can hear what the concern was. They can hear what created confidence. They can hear what changed after the decision. That kind of proof is not just saying the business is good, it's saying here's what trust looked like in a situation that may be close to yours. That is a different level of proof. The third job of proof is risk reduction. This is where most testimonials get exposed as weak because they sound positive, but they don't address the thing the buyer is actually worried about. Different buyers carry different risks. One person may be worried about being pressured. Another may be worried about wasting money. Another may be worried about the process becoming confusing. Another may be worried about choosing the wrong partner and having to explain the mistake later. Another may be worried that their situation is too complex or too personal or too specific to be understood. If the proof doesn't address the actual fear, it may not move the decision. That doesn't mean proof has to be dramatic, it just has to be specific. If the buyer is worried about the process being confusing, then useful proof shows that the business communicates clearly. If the buyer's worried that they'll be pushed into a decision, useful proof shows patience and guidance. If the buyer's worried that the project will spiral, useful proof shows organization and follow-through. If the buyer's worried nobody will understand the personal side of the decision, useful proof shows listening and judgment and care. That's why a strong client story is not just a compliment, it's a risk reduction asset. It shows the buyer someone else had concerns, made the decision, went through the process, and came out glad they chose this business. That is what praise usually fails to do. Praise says, oh, they were wonderful. Proof explains why that matters. The fourth job of proof is process confidence. That is especially important for high trust services. A lot of businesses assume the buyer only needs to believe in the outcome, but the buyer is also trying to picture the experience. What happens after I reach out? Who will I talk to? What will they ask me? Will I be expected to know exactly what I need? How does the relationship start? How do decisions get made? What happens if I'm not ready yet? The process itself becomes part of the proof. A clear process tells the buyer, this business knows how to guide people. In many high trust categories, the buyer is not an expert. They are choosing someone because they need help navigating something they don't fully understand. So if the process is invisible, the buyer has to imagine it. And people do not always imagine the best versions. They imagine pressure, confusion, awkward calls, endless follow-up, a sales process they can't escape, or a project that starts clean and becomes hard to manage. That's why process clarity matters. A process film can do a lot of this work. And by process film, I mean a short video that explains what happens when someone works with the business. It's not a commercial, it's not a hype reel for Instagram. A clear explanation of the first step, the relationship, the expectations, the way the business guides people. It helps the buyer see what happens next. It reduces the unknown. It makes the first step feel more reasonable. But process clarity is still only one part of the proof. It explains how the relationship works. It doesn't fully replace client proof. That is why the system needs both. The process film answers what happens if I reach out. The client story answers what was it like for someone who actually trusted them. Those are connected, but they're not always the same question. The fifth job of proof is comparison. This is one of the most overlooked parts. Buyers compare businesses whether you help them or not. They compare websites, they compare first impressions, price, what their friend told them. They compare how easy each business is to understand. If the business doesn't give them better criteria, they may compare on shallow criteria. Who looked more polished? Who had the cleaner homepage? Who had more reviews? Who seemed less confusing? Who was easier to contact? Some of those things matter, but they may not be the best way to choose. Strong proof helps the buyer compare on better criteria. A client story can show what actually mattered after the decision. Maybe it was not the flashy thing. Maybe it was how clearly the team communicated. Maybe it was how they handled complexity. Maybe it was how they explained hard decisions. Maybe it was how they made the client feel prepared. Maybe it was how they stayed steady when the client was overwhelmed. That kind of proof teaches the buyer what to pay attention to. It gives them a better frame for comparison. That's a very different testimonial than just saying great service. Great service is fine, but great service doesn't teach the buyer how to choose. Specific proof does. The sixth job of proof is portability. This matters more than most businesses realize. In many serious decisions, the person looking at your site is not the only person involved. They may need to talk to their spouse, a parent, a business partner, a leadership team, a board of directors, a colleague, an advisor, or maybe just the future version of themselves who has to live with the choice. So proof has to travel. It has to work when you are not there to explain it. This is where generic claims fall apart. If someone says, why are you considering them? The buyer needs a better answer than, well, I don't know, they seemed nice. Specific proof travels better. A client story video travels better. A clear process explanation video travels better. A strong point of view travels better. A film that shows the people, process, and client experience travels better than a vague paragraph buried on an about page. Because the buyer can send it, they can rewatch it, they can show someone else, they can use it to explain why the business made sense. That is one of the reasons film can be used in high-trust businesses. Again, not because video is automatically better. A bad video is still a bad video. Humanity has produced plenty of evidence there. But a clear film can carry certain things that are hard to carry in a short paragraph. How somebody talks, how they explain, how they think, how a real client describes the experience, how the process feels before the buyer enters it. That can make proof easier to carry, and if a buyer has to explain the decision to someone else, that matters. The seventh job of proof is placement. This is where a lot of businesses waste good assets. They may have real proof, but it is in the wrong place. A great client story buried 3 clicks deep on a blog page is not going to do the same thing as a client story placed next to the service page where the buyer is actually trying to make sense of the decision. A process explanation hidden in an FAQ is not going to do the same job as a clear process film placed before someone is asked to book a call. A strong founder explanation sitting in a social post from 8 months ago isn't doing the same job as a brand film on a homepage. Proof has to show up where the doubt happens. That is the difference between having proof and using proof. A collection says, here's the nice things people said. A strategy says, this proof answers this doubt for this buyer at this moment. You don't need endless proof. You need the right proof in the right place. So when I think about proof for a high-trust business, I'm not just thinking, do they have testimonials? I'm thinking, what does the buyer need to understand before reaching out? Where are they likely to hesitate? What would make the next step feel safer? What proof would help them explain the decision to somebody else? What belongs on the homepage? What belongs on the service page? What belongs in a referral follow-up? What belongs before the first call? This is where proof becomes useful. It's not a decoration. And this is why I don't think a single video can carry the whole decision. A brand film can introduce the business, it can explain who the people are and show how they think. That matters. But it can't do everything. It can't explain the full process, answer every uncertainty, provide outside proof at the same time. That is too much weight for one video. That's why I built this as a 3-film system. A brand film answers who are you and how do you think. The process film answers what happens if I reach out. And the client stories answer why did real people trust you and what was their experience like. Each film does a different job. Together, they make the entire business easier to evaluate before the first conversation. That's the real point, not just to make the business look good, but to make the decision easier. Serious buyers are not always looking for more content to consume. They are looking for enough confidence to move. They need to understand the business. They need to understand the process. And they need to see proof that feels specific to the decision they are making. And they need that before they become visible to you, before they fill out a form, before they book the call, before they raise their hand in class. So the question isn't, do we need proof? The question is, what does the buyer still need proof of? That's where I would start. At KBT Films, I build documentary-style film systems for high-trust businesses. The goal isn't just to collect compliments. The goal is to make trust easier to evaluate before the first serious conversation. And if you want to see what that looks like, start with the Peoples & Co. case study at my website, kbtfilms.com. Don't just watch whether the films look good. Watch what each film is doing. The brand film explains who they are, the process film explains how the relationship works, and the client stories show why real people trusted them. That's the difference between having proof on a page and building proof into the decision.